It gives me enormous pleasure now to introduce our final speaker for this session before we go to our Q&A and our discussion, and that is Robert Fitzgerald, the New South Wales Ageing and Disability Commissioner. And Robert is a lawyer by background. He has extensive experience in senior roles, all of which really have been fundamentally about achieving social justice for disadvantaged people. Those roles have included a period of time as a productivity commissioner. He's been the Community and Disability Services Commissioner and also the Deputy Ombudsman in New South Wales. And his many voluntary roles have included being the former president of the Australian Council of Social Services, the PEAK, that represents non-profit organisations providing all manner of social services across Australia. So it gives me great pleasure now to welcome Robert Fitzgerald.
I will cut my talk a little bit shorter so that we have full time for questions. But I really wanted to start off by saying that both Alistair and Lincoln have given a great insight. Lincoln in relation to the way in which policy actually comes into practice. And of course, Alistair has given almost a textbook way by which you can campaign for substantial change. But I want to be a bit more anecdotal if I can, and just sort of engage you in the process. I've been around public policy issues for a very long time, including the disability ageing, social welfare sphere. And the one thing I need to say to you is there's no rational way by which policy is developed in this country or just about anywhere else. It's not to say that good quality policy doesn't matter. In fact, it's essential. But what happens is you come to the realization that in and of itself, it is never enough. And so the way in which I see it is this is really planned opportunism and a heavy dose of perseverance. Because in a sense, you need the plan, you need the policy, you need a well-articulated proposition, and I'll come to that in a moment. But you also need to be able to take the opportunities as and when they present. And the truth of the matter is you never know when that will be. And the last thing you need is absolute perseverance, because no matter how dedicated you are to the cause of bringing about the reforms that are so worthwhile, it never happens in the time frame and it never happens in the manner that you think. But it is an extraordinarily important thing to do. And at the heart of this, the reason is people. And that's people living with Huntingtons and their carers and family members. And good quality policy reform is always about people, both at the beginning and at the end of that process. But I can just use a couple of examples to illustrate my point. The first was I was head of ACOS, as duly indicated, and we had been advocating for a program to provide dental services for low-income people. And we couldn't get it up. We couldn't get it up under Labor or the coalition. And suddenly I was presenting a briefing to a Prime Minister of the day. And just by way of casual conversation, he mentioned his daughters had just had orthodontic treatment. And instantaneously, I said, fine, well, what about this dental program? And what actually happened was it actually appeared in the budget, the very next budget. The truth of the matter is the next Prime Minister that came along, daughters had perfect teeth, and of course that program got reduced. So there's an illustration where we had a well-formulated plan, not successfully adopted, and then because of personal circumstances of the Prime Minister, it happened. The second thing is never fail to understand that politicians actually don't understand necessarily the issues we're talking about until they're absolutely confronted. I remember I was in the office of a health minister at the time, and he said, "It's good to see you, Robert." And he said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Well, Minister, poor people become ill." And from that moment, we had a conversation. But it was as if the issue of social disadvantage and illness was not necessarily a health issue. And so, again, it was a lesson to me that you can never assume that people understand the sorts of issues we're talking about. In relation to public policy for Huntington's, I think it's an extraordinary achievement by the Scottish Huntington's Association to achieve what they've done. But the first starting point for me is that proposal. What is the policy or the proposal, or the way I want to put it, the proposition that you want to be adopted? And right at the moment, there are great opportunities in relation to your own area because of the Aged Care Royal Commission, because of the Disability Royal Commission, and I think more generally because there is a concern about the health and well-being of people generally. But the decision you've got to make is whether you're going to go for the big ticket item, the whole-scale reform, the care framework, as you've seen in relation to Scotland, as we've seen in relation to the campaign by Dementia Australia, or you're going to take a more incrementalist approach, and that is to seek smaller, more defined, more achievable outcomes. The truth of the matter is I think they come together. You need the big plan and the big vision, and you need to be promoting that. But you also need to be saying to politicians and to bureaucrats right throughout Australia, these are also incremental steps that we need to achieve. And I know for certain, talking to Lewis and others, that you have both of those. You have a grand vision, and that shouldn't be lost. But you should also be very clear about what it is that you want in the short term. And right at the moment in Australia, I've got to say to you, the big reform is not on the table. Big reform has been replaced by what we call incrementalist. And there is a view by politicians and senior bureaucrats that it's almost impossible to achieve big reform. But you know, that can't be true in the long term, because we are a nation that is capable of enormous reforms in our Medicare system, in relation to our educational systems, but also you've seen this in relation to NDIS. And I was privileged to be a commissioner on the Productivity Commission that recommended the NDIS. So I don't buy this argument that we can't get big reform up. But I do believe that right at the moment, there is a hesitancy. So again, I think you need to go with the big ticket and the incrementalist approach. The second thing is it's about what I can call partnerships or puffery. There's a creature, many creatures, that when they're mating or fighting, blow themselves up, make themselves bigger than they really are. And in the Australian context, the frill-neck lizard is one of those. When the frill-neck lizard wants to mate, it puts out its frill and it becomes an awesome display, twice the size of it normally. And similarly, it does so when it's fighting. So whether you see public policy as a courting or a courtship approach, or you see it as a fight, you've got to increase your size and presence. And for people with Huntington's, there's 2,000 of people who are living with Huntington's today, and another 8,000 at risk. It's a relatively small group. But nevertheless, by creative partnerships, including with other groups that are dealing with rare health conditions, and I know that Huntington's is doing that through the Rare Voices Coalition, which is a terrific coalition, by working with healthcare professionals, by working with other community groups, then in fact, you can in fact make yourself much bigger. So the fact that this is the largest of the rare diseases doesn't mean that you can't have voice and presence, but it is absolutely critical that you form alliances and partnerships. And sometimes those are unlikely. Sometimes it's not simply with people that have an interest in your particular condition, but they have an interest in the broader issues of health reform, or aged care reform, or disability reform, or in fact, sometimes just social justice groups. And sometimes I think people fail to understand the importance of those alliances. Very importantly, Alistair made the comment that they had a development group which worked with them in the establishment of that plan. And he talked about that, the cohorts that were included in that, professional groups, nursing groups, medical groups, but also social service type groups as well. So again, who are the natural alliances and who are the alliances that you need to create in order to make what you're talking about have greater presence and greater voice? And it's a very important part of the strategy. Otherwise, unfortunately, those areas where there are only a small number of people affected, no matter how badly affected, frankly, don't get on the radar of decision makers at public policy level, either at the bureaucratic level or at the political level. The third thing is the politics of this. And the challenge for you is to say, why should a politician be interested in this area? And there can be a number of reasons. There can be reports that require responses, such as royal commissions. There can be a crisis in the care system when we see that from time to time, and ministers are suddenly caused to act. However, the most important way in which politicians react is through empathy. That is, there's a personal connection to the issue you're presenting. So with ACOS and other groups, we always took consumer representatives. We always took people that were directly affected by those policies. Low-income people, sole parents. The same in the disability area. You would never go unless you had somebody directly affected. And the reason for that is not to simply have a token person there. It's actually to build understanding and empathy from the point of view of the actual person affected, the family member, the carer, the person with Huntington. And my experience with politicians and senior public servants is that's the thing that finally gets you over the edge. If you can present a well-defined policy or plan which can be implemented, particularly ministers also want some legacy. They want to leave something. And the truth is they can't leave very much. The way governments operate means that ministers really can't do a lot, but they can do something. And in the space that you're in, I think that you can create that. But that requires people living with Huntington's and those around them and supporting them need to have the capacity and the desire and the willingness to actually face-to-face with politicians. Another point about that is it's not those that are necessarily in government, it's those that will be in government into the future. And that is very young MPs, newly elected MPs on both sides of politics, the opposition and the crossbench. You can certainly concentrate on trying to have the minister of the day or the government of the day push through the reforms. And ultimately, that's what happens. But one of the great techniques of really effective groups is they start working on MPs as soon as a new MP is elected. They go and see them. They send them materials. They ring them up to congratulate them. They support them when they're frankly a nobody. Because one day they will in fact be a shadow spokesperson or ultimately a minister, and they will remember that. And so part of this technique is it's a long-term courtship, if you want, with politicians at all levels of all persuasions and at all points, parts of their career. And it does pay dividends. If you've spent the time talking to younger MPs, then that will pay dividends. And just a couple of very quick last points about this. Ultimately, it's the public. How do you engage the public? And this is really, I think, where we can learn from other groups such as dementia and many others. And that is to target the media that can in fact advance the story. And in this space, media is your friend. You may have different views about media, but my experience is media is your friend in relation to this. You have stories to tell. Now, I can't imagine how hard it is to live with Huntington's or to care for people that are living with it. But I also know the reluctance of people to come forward and tell their stories, to share their circumstances, good and bad. But the truth of the matter is it's an essential feature of the world in which we live. It's not just mainstream media, it's also social media. The ability to put out good news stories, bad news stories, controversial stories through the social media is part and parcel of doing advocacy today. And you can also ensure that you can invite other people to participate with you. You can get politicians at photo opportunities. You can get other celebrities or leading people to join you in a Facebook campaign. I don't pretend to understand it all, but I do understand its significance today. And again, it's that willingness to share with the public these stories. And finally, I think it comes back to about having voice and presence in the community more generally. The story that you've got is a complex one. The condition certainly is. But most people have no understanding of this condition, as they have very little understanding of other rare conditions as well. But it's about trying to have voice and presence in policy terms, voice and presence in the community more generally, voice and presence within the public. And that's a very difficult thing to achieve. But nevertheless, it is the challenge. Scotland showed us, I think, in an extraordinary way, one way by which that's been achieved, a textbook campaign for getting reform in a particular area. Sometimes, however, it requires a bit more guerrilla warfare. You've actually got to pick issues, pick persons, pick targets at particular times, accessing those opportunities. Sometimes it's very different. You enter this space from a very different space. And I'll give you an example of that, the engagement of corporate leaders. Corporate leaders have enormous influence on both parties. They are the people that have dinners with people in power. They're the people that actually get access to the lodge in a way that you and I never would. So again, it's finding those people that can support you in this campaign. But if we want voice and presence to bring about change, then those are the sorts of strategies we have to adopt. I think that Huntington's understands this well. I think we can look at other groups like dementia and learn from them. I think we can look at how the NDIS came about. And there was a real campaign for that. And maybe I'll just end on that point about the NDIS itself, a huge reform. What were some of the elements in that? The first was a recognition the current system for the support of people with disabilities was failing, report after report. The second, a very strong coalition of service providers, consumer groups, advocacy bodies beyond the actual disability and health sectors, all galvanising to call for a reform. The third was a willingness to come up with an agreed plan or agreed reform strategy, even if people didn't agree with every element of it. And many people didn't agree with every element of the NDS and still don't. But there was enough commonality to allow a campaign. The fourth was to target particular politicians. Then the parliamentary secretary, Bill Shorten in the Labor Party, who was in power, but also power brokers like John Della Bosca, behind the scenes men, numbers men, all of those terrible things you hear about, they all matter. And in the end of the day, they then did a very interesting thing. They got an inquiry by the Productivity Commission to ultimately push it so that you had the evidence base for it. So that's just an example of a very large campaign that really was very successful after 20 or 30 years of failed attempts. So as Alistair indicated, these are not easily won campaigns at that level. You're talking about something much less than that. But I do think some of the elements, the campaign elements that were present in the NDS campaign and our present in the aged care reforms, I might also say, are lessons for the learning. So Julie, I might leave it there and open it up for questions. And I'm sorry that you've got me coming through this particular device, but hopefully it worked.